This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Graham Davis. I'm the chairman of the New Zealand UK Link Foundation Trust, a not very onerous and extremely enjoyable job. And we do a variety of things. Our main activity at the moment is bringing visiting professors over from New Zealand to talk on topical issues, and we have one who just arrived who is going to talk about health services migration. So we try to show that there are many areas where New Zealand has grappled with issues which have universality and which we see governments here and in Europe grappling with. This is our inaugural annual lecture, and we are very privileged indeed to have Sir Hew Strachan give it. And you'll hear more from Professor Philip Murphy, who is the Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies here, in a moment. My job, as I said, was to welcome you on behalf of the Trust. I also have that exciting role, and that is to tell you about the housekeeping. We do have this minor problem that from time to time the fire alarm goes off. In the event that it does, I have to regret to inform you, the assembly point, you go out the main entrance, and the assembly point is in Mount Street. We are all working on the assumption that it would be very rude to go off and upset our distinguished speaker. It is a very topical time with the 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War, and when Sir Hew accepted the invitation to speak, I was particularly delighted. I've had the pleasure of working with him for a very long time. Before he went to be the Chichele Professor of History of War in Oxford, he was actually a Professor of History in the University of Glasgow, where I was the Vice Chancellor. So we have known each other well, and we live really in the country quite near each other in the Southern Islands. So there are some nice connections, but most of all, the connection is to have, and I suspect many of you may have seen the television series from the middle of the last decade about the First World War. We are just deeply honored to have him to speak to us tonight. And Philip, if you would like to present.
Thank you, Graham. Welcome everyone to Senate House and to the School of Advanced Study. I'm Philip Murphy, Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, as Graham said, and Deputy Dean of the School of Advanced Study, which is made up of 10 separate institutes specialising in the arts and humanities. I'd like to thank Sir Graham and Lisa Fletcher and all the other people involved in the New Zealand UK Link Foundation, both for helping to make this event, this inaugural lecture, possible, but for all their efforts over the last year, bringing over, as Graham said, some very distinguished visiting professors from New Zealand to spend time in the school and to make their expertise available to scholars in the UK. It's been a huge success, and we're very, very grateful to them. And we're also very grateful to the New Zealand High Commission for helping to sponsor the reception this evening and providing us with some very delicious wines. Thank you so much. It's my great pleasure to introduce Sir Hew Strachan, the Chichele Professor of the History of War at New College, Oxford. So he was born in Edinburgh. He spent much of his early academic career at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, first as an undergraduate, then as a research fellow, and then as a college tutor. As Graham said, from 1992 to 2000, he was Professor of Modern History at the University of Glasgow, and then moved on to his current post in Oxford. His extensive publication list established him very early on, I think, as one of Britain's leading military historians, with books like From Waterloo to Balaclava and The Politics of the British Army. And he was commissioned by Oxford University Press to produce a multi-volume history of the First World War, the first volume of which came out in 2001 to very great acclaim. He published a one-volume survey of the First World War in 2004. And there are many other strings to Sir Hew's bow. In May this year, he was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Tweeddale, and he's also Brigadier in the Reserves. So, this year, of course, has seen the beginning of what will be a prolonged process of remembering and memorialising the First World War as we track the centenary of its key moments. And it's entirely appropriate then that we have with us this evening, really, I would say the preeminent expert on the British role in the First World War. So he has spoken publicly about the opportunity this anniversary offers to think afresh about the meaning of the war, its causes and its consequences. In a recent interview published in the Daily Telegraph, he counselled against focusing exclusively in the UK upon the impact of the war on our local communities. He said we need to go from local to global and to be able to put local commemoration in the broader context. If you put these things together, the local and the global, they do connect. So the focus of this lecture on the imperial context of the war is a very valuable one. In recent years, of course, there's been a growing recognition of the importance of writing about and memorialising the contribution of soldiers from across the Commonwealth, many of whose descendants subsequently settled in the UK. From this laudable aim, perhaps emerges another risk, that we at some level recreate the legend of the empire fighting loyally shoulder to shoulder in both world wars, without acknowledging the huge problems and tensions which that military mobilisation imposed on the sometimes rather rickety structures of imperial control. And alongside these were, of course, the ideological tensions, which relate to a key question that still troubles us 100 years on. Why did we fight? Was it, as Sir Hew poses in his title, for democracy or empire? We're delighted to have Sir Hew with us this evening, and I'm sure we're all very keen to hear his reflections on this important issue. So thank you very much, Sir.
Thank you both very much. It was very kind of Sir Graham Davies to say that we worked together. Let's be clear, he was my boss. He'd also produced an interesting situation, a New Zealander controlling my life of work, and then of course being married to a New Zealander, the issue of returning to a similar situation at home. Carla would say she's never managed, never mind. I want to begin with two quotations, both of them members of the British Empire during the First World War, but each of very different backgrounds from the other. The first came from New Zealand, from the South Island, the second from here, from Britain. The first was a private soldier in the First World War, the second was a field marshal. Before 1914, the first was an itinerant worker who sometimes had brushes with the law, and the second was the King Emperor. So let me begin with the first, and that's somebody I dare say known to at least a representative sample here, I don't know how representative. John A. Lee, born in Dunedin in 1891, served with the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, and after the war, Member of Parliament, Labour Member of Parliament for Auckland East between 1922 and 1928, and then Grey Lynn between 1931 and 1943. During the Third Battle of Ypres, Lee single-handedly, according to his account at any rate, took on a machine gun post near the White Sheet Road and then captured the 4 gunners. He later in the same day
when the Taranaki company was checked by an enemy post, accompanied two others who worked round behind the enemy and rushed the post. They captured 40 men and 2 machine guns, and Lee was duly awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. During the German spring offensives of 1918, Lee lost his left arm, and he then began to write during the period of his convalescence, initially about that experience, the experience of 1918, in a book that was called simply Soldier, which was not published until 1976. But the book that I want to begin with came out earlier than that, even if it was written later. It's his account of 1917, which has a fictionalized version of the action in which he won his medal, and was published in 1937 under the title Civilian into Soldier. A title which captures exactly the themes that I want to address, at least some of the themes I want to address. The dilemma of military service for citizens within the army. For the thinkers of the Enlightenment, you can just cast your mind back from 1914 to the 18th century. Preeminently, I suppose, for Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract, the argument ran that those citizens to whom the state gave legal and political rights had a reciprocal obligation to defend the state when it was under attack. So, in this understanding of democracy, at the heart of its ideas, at least for a continental state, which needed a large army to defend itself, like France, was the idea that civic rights carried military duties. That has never been a view which has attracted much attention or support on this side of the channel. And it certainly, although it was debated before 1914, did not attract much support here in London before 1914. For Britain and its empire before the First World War, defence was entrusted to the Royal Navy. The empire's principal strengths lay in its ships, and they were crewed by seafarers who, at least by then, if not 100 years previously, were voluntarily enlisted. For most Britons before the First World War, compulsory military service represented not the corollary of political freedom, but its loss. Enlistment in the army, whether voluntary or conscripted, represented the abandonment of rights rather than their defence. And that was exactly John Lee's problem. He begins Civilian into Soldier with the arrival of his reinforcement from New Zealand here in Britain on Salisbury Plain. And there they encountered for the first time a British regular regimental sergeant major. Silence! What a snarl was in that voice to soldiers from New Zealand, he writes. Soldiers used to the tone and method of volunteer RSMs and officers. In New Zealand, militarism had been endured for war's sake. As on Salisbury Plain, it was worshipped for its own sake. In New Zealand, men were civilians who had volunteered. In Sling, that's the slang for Salisbury Plain, they were now new material to feed to an impersonal machine. Late the previous night, the reinforcement had stumbled into camp to find the civilian bond which welded officer to man severed. No longer were officer and man equal adventurers. At once the reinforcement became other ranks, automata. The civilian army had to be put to death, and out of it automata had to be resurrected. They were addressed by an officer. Men, I welcome you to camp. You are no longer civilians in uniform. Here you will find out you are soldiers in training. We give orders once only. When men disobey, correction is swift and severe. God save the king, whispered Lee's neighbour. So let's move from Lee to George V. On the 10th of September 1914, the king sent a message to the empire, or more specifically, to the dominions and to India. In it he had said, quoting him, "During the past few weeks, the peoples of my whole empire, at home and overseas, have moved in with one mind and purpose to confront and overthrow an unparalleled assault upon the continuity of civilization and the peace of mankind. The calamitous conflict is not of my seeking. My voice has been cast throughout on the side of peace. Had I stood aside when, in defiance of the pledges to which my kingdom was a party, the soil of Belgium was violated and her cities laid desolate, when the very life of the French nation was threatened with extinction, I should have sacrificed my honour and given to destruction the liberties of my empire and of mankind. I rejoice that every part of the empire is with me in this decision." The version that was sent to India then diverged from that which was promulgated in Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. That which was addressed to the princes and peoples of my Indian empire went on to speak of, to quote, "the passionate devotion to my throne expressed both by my Indian subjects and by the feudatory princes and reigning chiefs of India, and their prodigal offers of their lives and their resources to the cause of my realm." Here was a different message from that of John Lee. For Lee, military service meant loss of liberty. For the king, military service was invoked in defence of liberty. But the paradox in the imperial position rested not just on the nature of military service and its loss of personal freedom. That, after all, could be justified by the claim that this was a war fought for a broader understanding of freedom. It lay rather in the nature of the empire itself. The king, after all, had addressed Indians as his subjects, and yet he explained the purpose of the war in terms of protecting the liberties of his empire. The rhetoric of imperial mobilization in August 1914 had no problem in yoking together the ideas that this was a war for the defense of empire and a war for the defense of democracy. It was a combination of views reflected in the speeches of politicians and in the publications produced by such effective organisations as, or ineffective sometimes, as the Oxford Faculty of Modern History. In December 1914, R.W. Seton Watson and Alfred Zimmern produced, together with others, a book called The War and Democracy. The democracy they were addressing was actually rather more the democracy of the Habsburg Empire, but what they wrote in their preface is revealing. We have called the book The War and Democracy because our guiding idea throughout has been the sense of the great new responsibilities, both of thought and action, which the present situation lays upon British democracy and our belief in democracy, and on believers in democracy throughout the world. So how far can we actually describe the British Empire of 1914 as a democratic and progressive institution? In 1883, Sir John Seeley, the Cambridge man, you will have noticed that Graham and I are both wearing our Hawks ties tonight. That was not conspiracy, it's coincidence. In 1883, Sir John Seeley had published, he was a Cambridge man at the Cambridge History Faculty Library today, it's the Seeley Library, had published an ideological justification for empire called The Expansion of England. It sold 80,000 copies in 2 years, and it still sold 11,000 copies in 1919, the year after the war had ended. By then, Seeley himself had been dead a quarter of a century. Seeley divided the empire into three parts. First, there were the colonies of white settlement, the dominions to whom the king addressed the bulk of his remarks in 1914. Secondly, there was India, which Seeley saw as anomalous and exceptional, in which Britain's rule depended on the cooperation of the Indian Army, and where Britain was only the latest in a long line of Asiatic despots. And thirdly, there was the colonial empire of West Africa, West India, and the West Indies, a whole swathe of colonies which his progressive view of empire quietly ignored. Seeley, like those who followed him, took as the model of empire, in other words, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. An empire which for them was linked consensually rather than by force and was united by race and culture. Sir Edward Grey, one of the three key Liberal imperialists in the cabinet in 1914, and of course the Foreign Secretary, and he had been Foreign Secretary from 1905, saw the empire in very similar terms. In 1902, he divided the empire into the self-governing colonies, secondly India, exactly the same distinction as that made by Seeley, and thirdly what he called uncivilized countries, into whose rule Britain had been forced by pressure and competition from other European powers. A nice convenience, that argument. In 1914, the King's words to India had reflected that intermediate status identified by Seeley and Grey, and it was one with which extraordinarily many Indians were prepared to live, at least for the time being. Here in London, on the 14th of August, Gandhi attended a reception in his honour at the Cecil Hotel. He told Indians that Britain's position in relation to the war's outbreak should be supported, and that for the moment at least, they should think imperially. During the course of the war, Britain did at least begin to respond to the demands of the Congress Party, and in 1917, the Montagu-Chelmsford Report declared an intention to work towards the gradual development of free institutions in India with a view to ultimate self-government. There was, of course, no deadline for self-government. The commitment was open-ended and indeterminate, but there was that undertaking. The effect of the First World War's outbreak on those parts of the empire which Seeley neglected and which Grey deemed uncivilized suggested that many of His Majesty's subjects did see British rule in a progressive light. In Jamaica, the black nationalist and Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey, who had just returned to the West Indies from 2 years' study at Birkbeck, founded an organisation called the Universal Negro Improvement and Conservation Association and African Communities League. Doesn't make an easy acronym, does it? Garvey wrote a letter on behalf of this organisation on the 16th of September to the Colonial Secretary, and he began by saying, mindful of the great protecting and civilizing influence of the English nation and people of whom we are subjects, and their justice to all men, and especially to their Negro subjects scattered all over the world, hereby we beg to express our loyalty and devotion to His Majesty the King. The point of his loyalty was, of course, not just subordination. The point was, and did have, an ulterior motive. The Federalist, a liberal paper published in Jamaica, wrote on the 27th of October 1915, as coloured people, we will be fighting for something more, something inestimable to ourselves. We will be fighting to prove to Great Britain that we are not so vastly inferior to the whites, that we should not be put on a level at least of that we should be put on a level at least of political equality with them. We will be fighting to prove that we are no longer merely subjects, but citizens, citizens of a world empire whose watchword should be liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In South Africa, on the 6th of August 1914, so only the day after Pretoria got news of the war's outbreak, the South African Native National Congress, the forerunner of today's ANC, offered to raise 5,000 infantry for imperial service. Both blacks and coloureds within South Africa used war as a vehicle to stress their loyalty and to show London the argument that this was indeed a war for democracy, and used that to argue that cooperation, not a confrontation with the South African government, could be the route to citizenship for all South Africans. For them, Rousseau's argument held good that military service carried the corollary of civic rights, and perhaps it was precisely for that reason that the South African government had absolutely no intention whatsoever of accepting their offer of military service. The best that they could get was acceptance as the South African Native Labour Corps later in the war. South Africa was, however, the only one of the 4 white settler dominions to produce overt resistance to supporting Britain's request that it undertake military action. He came, however, of course, not from the black population, but from the die-hard Afrikaners who rebelled in 1914 and crossed over into Namibia, into German Southwest Africa. South Africa's divided response to the outbreak of the war provides the counterpoint to the reaction in each of the other white settler dominions, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And it is those 3 that I want to devote the bulk of what I still have to say. When all is said and done, the vision of a progressive democratic empire, harboured by Seeley and by the liberal imperialists, was based on those 3 countries preeminently, not on the empire as a whole. Moreover, those 3 also underpinned the imperial vision fostered by Alfred Milner and his kindergarten. Milner had been, as South Africa's High Commissioner during the Boer War, during the South African War, and in many ways the instigator, of course, of that war. And in December 1916, Milner would join Lloyd George's War Cabinet, and in April 1918 become Secretary of State for War. In May 1913, Milner published a collection of his essays on imperialism called The Nation and the Empire. And forgive another quotation as I just read what he said. Imperialism as a political doctrine has often been represented as something tawdry and superficial. In reality, it has all the depth and comprehensiveness of a religious faith. It is a mistake to think of it as primarily concerned with the acquisition of territory. There is quite enough painted red already. It is a question of preserving the unity of a great race and of enabling it, by maintaining that unity, to develop freely on its own lines and to continue to fulfill its distinctive mission in the world. The communities of the same origin, the same language, the same political and social structure, and the same type of civilization, with all that they have to cherish, should develop and defend in common, should fail to stand together, and should, owing to that failure, run the risk of falling separately under alien domination, would be as unnatural as suicide. And it would be a dereliction of duty, for the British race has become responsible for the peace and order and just and humane government of 750 million people who do not possess the gift of maintaining peace and order for themselves. The Pax Britannica is essential to the maintenance of civilized conditions of existence among 2/5 of the human race. Our share of the white man's burden is an exceptional share, and we can bear it only if we bring to the task the individual strength of the British race throughout the world, with all its immense possibilities of growth. In other words, Milner imagined that white settlers in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa would be equal partners in this enterprise, even if the rest of the empire was not to be equal. And what he imagined was an empire built on progressivism and political reform, in a sense only that it might imply economy and efficiency in the running of the empire, not in the sense that it implied its democratization. Indeed, in March 1915, in an exchange about the value or not of democracy in the effective waging of this war, Milner was pretty clear. He wrote that he regarded democracy as a necessary evil. I accept it, he wrote, without enthusiasm, but with absolute loyalty, in order to make the best of it. His agenda for empire, economic and strategic, and his programme underpinned the big organisational frameworks, such as the calling of the Imperial Conference in 1907 and 1911, and the rebranding of the General Staff of the British Army as an Imperial General Staff in 1909. Milner's vision of imperial unity was one, in that sense, specifically adapted for war. But it is nonetheless perverse that today's understanding of the outbreak of the First World War and its impact on empire and its impact in an imperial context should be should be so underpinned by the delusion that this business of imperial mobilization was a matter of coercion rather than of consent. The dominions of Australia, Canada and New Zealand, just to focus on those three, were indeed not free to reach their own decisions to enter the war. That was a matter for London. But they were free to make their own decisions as to how they would fight that war, how they would contribute to it. All three of them addressed the latter issue before they had been formally asked by Britain to engage with the former one. All three showed themselves ready to create bodies of troops to serve overseas, and indeed vying with each other in their readiness to contribute to an imperial war effort. Britain itself did not declare war until 11 p.m. British time on the 4th of August 1914, and did not formally take the decision to dispatch the British Expeditionary Force to France or to destroy the German wireless stations overseas, the wireless stations that were so essential to German cruiser warfare and indeed the first targets for the forces of Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, until the days immediately after the outbreak of the war. That was a full week after the Dominions had begun to respond to the threat of war. On the 30th of July 1914, in Canada, Colonel Sam Hughes, the militia minister, convened the Militia Council and agreed, or it agreed, no doubt, when you speak about Hughes, that particular Hughes, as well as the Australian Hughes, it's often quite hard to distinguish dictatorial behaviour from consent. But anyway, formally speaking, the Militia Council agreed that 20,000 soldiers should be sent overseas in the event of war. And on the 1st of August 1914, Canada asked Britain how it could help. In New Zealand, the Prime Minister, William Massey, offered an expeditionary force on the 31st of July. And on the following day, a columnist writing in the New Zealand Herald said that the average New Zealander, especially the young New Zealander who lives in the country, enlists before he is enrolled. Australia's reaction was more confused and slightly delayed, but that was primarily because there was an election going on. On the 31st of July 1914, the opposition leader, Andrew Fisher, promised Australians, to quote, last man and last shilling. And on the 3rd of August, the cabinet met, a rather depleted cabinet as it happened, but they met, and they promised 20,000 troops, not just to make sure they weren't turned down by Canada. In all three countries, the public manifestations of so-called war enthusiasm and the tone of the press were no different and possibly even more supportive of war than they were here in Britain. Moreover, all three countries were, formally speaking, more democratic than Britain, than was the mother country in 1914. When Britain went to war in 1914, roughly 60% of men, and self-evidently no women, had the vote. In the army, many of those who fought and died during the First World War lacked the most basic political right, the right to vote. They were disenfranchised on the grounds of age, if they were under 21, or because they lacked property, or indeed because of their military service, which meant that they were of no fixed household. New Zealand provides a striking contrast. The property qualification for voting was removed in 1879, women got the vote in 1893, and the Maori had at least some political rights, even if it still amounted to underrepresentation, and it had enjoyed it since 1867. In Australia, attending just a federal law, the 1902 Commonwealth Act gave voting rights to all men and women aged over 21, although it specifically excluded the Aboriginal population, who of course did not get the vote until 1962. In Canada, Canada introduced a centralised as opposed to a provincial franchise in 1885. But it was based on property, it excluded what would today be called First Nation Canadians, and it excluded women. Canada's vote was therefore almost as restricted as Britain's. But it, unlike Britain, did acknowledge that democratising effects should follow from military service during war. In September 1917, as Canada faced pressure to conscript, it accepted the corollary of conscription, that is, that those who were forced to fight should have political representation. The Military Voter Act was designed also to ensure that those who had themselves volunteered for military service would have the vote, because it was hoped that if they had the vote, they were likely to accept conscription too, and would vote in favour if there were a referendum. So all those who had any military association, military service, male or female, First Nation Canadians, those aged under 21 included, were given the vote in 1917. And the Wartime Elections Act went on to give the vote to the spouses, widows, mothers, sisters and daughters of those who served in Canadian forces. It specifically disenfranchised those who refused to serve. So a very clear relationship was established. Canada's 1917 legislation on voting was designed quite explicitly to enable Sir Robert Borden's Conservative government to win the election of December 1917, which it did, not least because it collected the military vote from France and Flanders and then redistributed those to all marginal constituencies where it had to secure a clear majority. Australia, like Canada, held an election in 1917 on the 5th of May in this case. Like Canada's, it was focused not least on the issue of conscription, and even more than Borden, the Australian Prime Minister, the other Hughes, Billy Hughes, proved to be a deeply divisive figure. His electoral proceedings can only be described as close to corrupt. Hughes was expelled from his own Labour Party because of his attitudes in support of conscription. And Australian national mobilisation more generally split the Labour Party, forcing Hughes to form a nationalist party with long-term electoral consequences for the Commonwealth, the Australian Commonwealth. The parallel with David Lloyd George is recognisable, because when David Lloyd George, a Liberal, became Prime Minister in December 1916, he did not become the leader of the Liberal Party. The leader of the Liberal Party remained the former Prime Minister, H.H. Asquith, and so Lloyd George relied on Conservative support in order to form his government. Britain did not hold an election. The election was due in 1915. Lloyd George became Prime Minister without any election. And the conclusion was that Britain should not hold an election until the war was over. When it did, when Lloyd George went to the country, he went to the country on the back of a still divided party. And those Liberals who supported him and supported the coalition received the coupon, and those who did not, with the result, of course, that coupon Liberals were returned in large numbers, and those who were couponless did not. The coalition was restored to power. By not holding a wartime election, the British government was effectively ruling this country without a parliamentary mandate. The election was due in 1915, as I already said, although one argument that was produced in 1915 was that it would have been based on an out-of-date register. Moreover, the fact that Asquith had formed a coalition government in May 1915 and that Lloyd George's government too was a coalition gave the government at least some legitimacy. New Zealand, by contrast, if holding an election is one way that we can judge democracy, did do so. It held one in December 1914. That election returned Massey to power, and And so too, those who wanted those who wanted domestic political change were at least given the chance to express a view should they wish to do so. If they wished to oppose the war, in theory, they were given the chance to do so more freely in New Zealand than they were in Britain. When the First World War broke out, many national leaders in Europe recognized, at least subliminally, that war could have democratizing or even revolutionary consequences. In the last Great War, in the war against revolutionary France and against Napoleon, at least in the perception of the crowned heads of Europe, revolution in Europe had led to war in Europe. And in 1815, they had been determined to prevent war in order not least to prevent revolution. In 1848, they failed. Revolutions throughout Europe did lead to war, not least in the Habsburg Empire, which had been so anxious to prevent it. But the wars which followed the 1848 revolutions, the Crimean War, the War of 1859 in Italy, the wars of German unification, had not, in practice, had revolutionary consequences for the rest of Europe. Reform, gradual change, had, it seemed, developed the power to ensure consent short of revolution. And that was the lesson which even Russia seemed to have learned after its defeat of the Anzac Japan in 1904 and its own revolution of 1905, which it followed with some form and measure of constitutional reform. In the event, in the First World War, revolution did follow war, and indeed revolution was used as a weapon of war. In Ireland in 1916, in the Ottoman Empire in 1916-18, and in Russia in 1917. War therefore provided a test for more evolutionary change designed to ensure consent without provoking social and political divisions so extreme that catastrophe was followed, without provoking the sort of disunity which could undermine the national war effort. The capacity of Britain and its dominions, the dominions of Australia, Canada and New Zealand, to deliver on that agenda was tested in two very obvious directions when judged according to the expectations of enlightened political thought, and when judged by this idea of linking military obligations to political rights. The two directions are these. First of all, could Britain and its dominions develop domestic wartime legislation, effectively denying rather than promoting civic rights, which is what they felt war required of them, without provoking a reaction? And secondly, could they move from voluntary enlistment, from the form of military service sanctified by Adam Smith, Glasgow Lincoln, and who had advocated the principle of the division of labour, and move instead to the idea of military service? What I want to wrap this lecture up with is a couple of reflections on both those things. First of all, reflections on the issue of domestic wartime legislation. All four countries strengthened the powers of the state over the rights of the individual in ways that were not, in fact, fully dismantled once the war was over. In Britain, the Defence of the Realm Act, in origin a law to counter espionage, was passed on the 8th of August 1914. Originally, barely a paragraph long, it gave the government the power to curb freedom of expression, to use summary jurisdiction, to take over land, and it included the all-embracing clause, otherwise to prevent assistance being given to the enemy or the successful prosecution of the war being undertaken. It was the Defence of the Realm Act that prevented the flying of kites, the burning of bonfires, the sale of alcohol outside set hours, and of course, most famously, established British summertime. By 1917-18, the Defence of the Realm Act regulations were used to curb dissent of almost any form. In Australia, on the outbreak of war, the Australian government introduced the War Precautions Act, which gave the government the powers to govern by decree in the interests of public safety and defence, and the power to punish disloyalty to the Empire, not to Australia, but to the Empire. Hughes would use this legislation for his own purposes from October 1915, including for his own political advantage. By the war's end, there were over 100 such regulations. Hughes also introduced the Unlawful Associations Act of December 1916, which criminalised the Socialist Party of the industrial workers of the world. And in July 1917, he amended it to make membership of certain other political organisations illegal. One Labour MP said that this bill revived, in his words, all the rigours of past autocracies and applies them to those who happen to have different opinions and the courage to express them. Like the Germans in Belgium, the nationalists, i.e. Hughes' new party, say to the people, "We are anxious for your welfare, but if you do anything against us, you will be shot." Canada passed a War Measures Act on the 22nd of August 1914 to give the government the power to censor, to arrest and to deport, to control ports and harbours, trade and transport, and to appropriate property. The Supreme Court of Canada in July 1918 ruled that the Act had the power to amend other acts by way of regulation, as the Defence of the Realm Act did in Britain. In other words, the Canadian government just about had supreme powers. In New Zealand, the war regulations passed on the 19th of July 1915 made it an offence to make a statement likely to interfere with recruiting, training or discipline. In September, those regulations were extended to make it illegal to encourage violence or sedition, and in October, defence could be deemed to be prejudiced. You could be arrested for actions prejudicial to the war effort, however those were defined. The war regulations were increasingly used to support recruiting, and then of course to enforce conscription, and overall to suppress anti-militarism. Ultimately, however, the effectiveness of all four states in their use of wartime emergency legislation did indeed rest on consent as much as on coercion. The core point that unites all four states is the degree of social pressure that underpinned the mobilisation of the state, that legitimated the distribution of white feathers, that stigmatised shirkers and war profiteers. The trick for each of these four states was the capacity to pace their legislation and their introduction of compulsion so that it marched in step, or even sometimes behind the step, of public opinion more generally. Two governments, those of Britain and of New Zealand, managed that trick. Two, Australia and Canada, did not, with long-term consequences. And let me just move on to conscription to explain how Australia and Canada failed to manage it, and equally how Britain and New Zealand did manage it. Britain's move to conscription, finally accomplished in June 1916, was keenly watched in the other three dominions, which in general felt they would do well to follow London's example rather than to anticipate it. Four key points, I think, need to be made about the British adoption of conscription. First, the government did indeed lag behind public opinion in the move to compulsory military service. It gave the voluntary system every chance to work. Second, when it proceeded to introduce conscription, it did so as much to manage its labour supply across all activities, including especially industrial production, as it did to support the growth of the army. Thirdly, its military service tribunals, which had the power to enable exemptions, were not run by the War Office, but were local bodies presided over by those with local interests. As a result, on the understanding of the only full study we have of one particular area, which is of Northamptonshire, they reflected local needs rather better than they did those of the army. They reflected those of local families and those of the industries of Northamptonshire more than they reflected necessarily the concerns of the United Kingdom in its entirety. And fourthly, the government allowed for the principle of conscientious objection, and so acknowledged the concerns of those liberals who argued that individual rights simply had to be protected, or indeed Britain would become Prussian in order to defeat Germany. New Zealand's handling of the same issues, four issues, provides an instructive comparison. The government again lagged, or certainly appeared to lag, behind public expectation as it moved on towards conscription. It gave the voluntary principle every chance to work, so that the passage of the Bill for Compulsory Service in June 1916 had the short-term effect of actually boosting voluntary enlistment, which peaked in May and June 1916. Second, the universal vision which conscription reflected was the desire in New Zealand to ensure equality. Equality of sacrifice, equality of the burden of military service across families and across communities. The voluntary principle by 1916 had ceased to be associated with equality and had become a symbol of inequality. And thirdly, New Zealand's bill, unlike Britain's, did not make specific exemption on the grounds of conscientious objection, especially for religious reasons. An amendment to introduce conscientious objection was lost twice over in New Zealand. Conscientious objectors, famously of course in the New Zealand case, Archibald Baxter, found themselves forced into frontline service, 14 of them in all. All that was accomplished without serious internal division, however much Baxter's flame burns bright today. Canada also adopted conscription, but not until July 1917, after a year marked by war weariness and revolution. It was too late, it proved, to make much difference militarily. Of the 100,000 Canadians who conscripted, very few actually found their way to France. And what had happened instead was that voluntary enlistment in Canada had prompted nearly 40% of British-born Canadians to enlist. But many fewer native-born Canadians of British extraction, about 6%, and about 6% of foreign-born Canadians. What, in other words, conscription became when it was introduced was less a tool to make a large army, and more a tool to get foreign-born Canadians, and especially French Canadians, into the army. It was, therefore, deeply divisive. Only 1.4% of French Canadians had enlisted in the voluntary era. Borden decided to impose conscription in May 1917, as enlistments fell below replacement levels, and he fought the December 1917 election over the issue. Violence and rioting followed, and the demands for exemptions swamped the system of conscription when it was introduced. Most of those demands were made on economic and agricultural grounds. Nowhere, however, was conscription more divisive than in Australia. The lobbying in favour of conscription began in September 1915, before Australia confronted any serious shortfall in recruiting replacements for those who had died of Gallipoli. The pressure was increased by Hughes, who was anxious to double Australia's recruiting target and promised 50,000 more men to London in November 1915. Hughes's approach to the issue of conscription was entirely confrontational rather than consensual. And he would not respond to his own Labour Party's call for a reciprocal conscription of wealth as well as manpower. In the first conscription referendum, the difference between those who voted against, who were in the majority, and those who voted for was about 3.2%. And this difference was very similar when a second vote was forced by Hughes in December 1917. As in Canada, so in Australia, the effect was deeply divisive. Divisions along ethnic lines, along religious lines, and indeed on class lines. The Archbishop of Melbourne, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne, was a key figure in opposing conscription. When confronting the Anzac legend in 2015 and Australia's appropriation of it, New Zealanders might like to remind themselves that while they sent, and I'm sure they will, nearly 20% of their available males to war, Australia, like Canada, sent only 13.5%. Britain sent 27.4% and South Africa 11%. More males of military age than wartime Australia did not join up than did. New Zealand, of course, also claimed that its response to military service and to the demands of the First World War were more inclusive in another sense, in terms of race. The demand of Maori to be included in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force reflected that of the black troops in the West Indies and South Africa. The need to serve in order to advance civic rights. Maori Pomare especially pursued that argument. Although Maori were not at first liable for conscription, Pomare and others were determined they should be, and some indeed were. But Maori military participation over the war as a whole was about half that of Pakeha rates of recruitment. And Maori units in the end had to fall back on Cook Islanders to make up their strength. Ultimately, the imperial experience of conscription did little to advance the argument that military service would enhance political rights. Both Canada and Australia resisted recruiting their First Nation and Aboriginal populations. The pressure to do so came from London, as London sought more men in late 1915. When Canada and Australia responded, they did so more often by describing those whom they did enlist as having European origins rather than confront their own inherent racism. Not that Britain itself was any better. Universal male suffrage may have been introduced in 1918, but it came at the war's end and was not introduced as part and parcel of conscription itself, as a necessary corollary of military service. The award of votes to women specifically excluded those most likely to have completed any form of war service, as it was confined to those aged 13 and over. The Empire's acknowledgement of equality through military service was hardly a full embrace of the idea of the nation in arms, of a truly citizen army. The Empire found it easier to acknowledge the idea of equality in death than it did in life. In 1917, a royal charter established the Imperial War Graves Commission. The brainchild of an imperialist and Milnerite, Fabian Ware, it rested its commemoration of those who had died on an acceptance of the equality of sacrifice. No distinction was to be made according to rank, race, or class. And no bodies were to be repatriated, a principle that ensured that neither affordability nor distance from home should erode the idea of a democratic empire. The Royal Charter, which established the Imperial War Graves Commission, expressed the King's aspirations to keep alive, these are the words of the Charter, the ideas for the maintenance and defence of which they, that is the dead, have laid down their lives to strengthen the bonds of union between all classes and races in our dominions, and to promote a feeling of common citizenship and of loyalty and devotion to us and in the empire of which they are subjects. So that combination, both citizen and subject, anticipated and perpetuated in the King's message of 1914, was followed through in the charter that established the Commission and in the principles as developed and applied by Frederick Kenyon in the following year in 1918. When John Lee came to write his other book, to write the final chapter to his memoir begun in 1918, The Soldier, he concluded with a reflection on the unknown soldier, or the unknown warrior, just laid to rest, of course, in Westminster Abbey in November 1920. He wrote as follows: "Let us be fair, for in the capitals of all the great nations there is to be found the carcass of an unknown soldier. Aye, even in Westminster. Thus was a rancour permitted to jostle shoulders with the captains and the kings. Thus was the dead given liberty, never tolerated among the living. Poor devil of a corpse, Hide the stifle in that alien atmosphere, long for the bottom of a shell hole, that its spirit might wander in no man's land among the spirits of its comrades. What rancour wanted to be among the martinets? You're a private, the general will say. Yes, sir, the unknown will be compelled to click his heels and salute. I killed you to save democracy, the general will go on. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got about 15-20 minutes for questions. We're going to have a roving microphone, I think, too. Yeah. I know there's a lot of expertise out there, so please, if you could just introduce yourselves briefly first, to say who you are, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who want to ask questions, so if you can keep your questions brief and to the point. So the floor is open, ladies and gentlemen. Yes.
Thank you very much indeed for a most interesting talk. One of the things I'm not clear about, and it's, my position is slightly coloured from having heard previous lectures from your colleague of yours at Oxford Vernon Bognador, gave a series of lectures at Gresham College. And I got the impression a major factor whether Britain went to war would be dependent on whether Germany actually invaded Belgium or not. In other words, it dismisses neutrality.
Yeah.
Now, was there much genuine consultation between the British Foreign Secretary and the Dominions, or were the Dominions more or less just informed what was taking place rather than genuinely consulted on what their position would be?
It will be the responsibility of the Colonial Secretary rather than the Foreign Secretary to communicate to the Dominions and let them know what was happening. And I think in an informal sense, there isn't much going on, quite frankly. There is a great deal going on in terms of alerting them to the military situation and the possibility of the first steps being taken towards mobilisation. So when I said, the actual formal request to the Dominions to take military action is dispatched after the outbreak of war. What of course had also happened in Britain, as it was happening in the Dominions, was the alerting of the fleet, the issuing of live ammunition to troops, the initial steps towards mobilisation of the army, all of which begin about the 27th of July, indeed on the 27th of July, so earlier in the crisis. Where the consultation had taken place had really been in the Imperial Conferences of 1907 and 1911. I mean, those have been the moments when the possibility of the Empire having to act jointly in the event of war was being canvassed. What is striking, of course, if you look at the newspapers in, for example, New Zealand, is they are just as outraged by the Belgian issue as any newspapers in London would be. It's because that sense of imperial identity is very strong. And Hughes makes exactly the same points in Australia. I mean, Hughes may be a divisive figure in so many other ways, but he's very much a spokesman for the British Empire as well as for Australian interests. So if Belgium is seen as vital to Britain, if there mustn't be an overmighty Germany in the Low Countries facing Britain, then that is a matter of imperial concern as well as British concern.
Thank you. Yes, question.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for your lecture. Just a comment on New Zealand.
Can you just say who you
So, I'm Rod Edmond, University of Kent, New Zealand Studies Network.
Thank you very much.
Just a comment on the question of Maori participation in the war. Well, Maori, of course, didn't speak for all Maori, and leaders never speak for all their people, and that, of course, is something that underlies quite a lot of your lecture. But Waikato Maori did not volunteer for the war. When conscription was introduced, it was imposed punitively on Waikato Maori only, and many Waikato Maori were imprisoned as a result of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I entirely recognise that and accept that as point. I wondered, I mean, it's interest of time, because obviously there's a whole other set of arguments about not only the rights of Maori in this, but rights of First Nation Canadians and so on, all of which, if I could recommend a book by a former student of mine called Tim Weingart that looks at all four countries' comparison.
Thank you. There's a question towards...
My name is William Franklin. I'm an MA Military History student at the University of Buckingham. Sir Hew, despite the divisions over conscription, did this impact, why were the Canadian and Australian call so effective by mid-1918? Did conscription have any impact on that at all?
Well, the argument, you would obviously be able to make the argument they're fighting better because they're volunteer soldiers, and I think there's not, that there may well be some truth in that. I mean, one of the other issues here, though, is are you trying to maintain, and New Zealand is very sensible, are you trying to maintain an establishment which your manpower base can maintain, or are you trying to maintain an establishment which is too big given your flow of recruits? And the challenge that Australia in particular confronts is that essentially with the 4 divisions that it creates at the beginning of the war, it's already maintaining by the end of the war an establishment that it's struggling to fill. I mean, it does fill just, but that's its constant pressure. Australians, this is a point made very strongly by Joan Clement in her new book on Australia in the First World War, so I quickly, in case there are any Australians here, deflected onto an Australian observation. But Australians are very good killers. I mean, that is the thing for which they're respected in 1917-18. And she makes that point, very powerfully when talking about Bulgur and so on. And so that is undoubtedly true. That they are seen as effective formations. The other point that's often made about the Australian call by 1918, remember the New Zealand division has been taken away from the call in 1918, is that it is ethnically and nationally, perhaps not, yes, ethnically too, I suppose in some respects, but certainly nationally united in a way that other formations are not. And the same applies to Canada. So that it has greater political influence in terms of having a direct capacity to link to its own country and its own government. And that means that something that Haig has to attend to when he's handling it. But I think you could well sustain the argument that there is here something to do with voluntarism and equality of soldier, which may be reflected indeed in whether Canadians and the Australians. But I haven't got any evidence to support that beyond the supposition that is behind your question.
Thank you. More questions? Yes.
Lizzie Condor. There is quite a field of particularly popular historiography that sees the First War, in particular Gallipoli onwards, as being the birth of nationhood. In Australia, it's very strong, and also to a certain extent in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Given the places where they are democratically pre-war, particularly New Zealand with the suffrage,
yeah.
how much would you put in that sees the First War being this birth of a nation as a separate identity versus the Dominion or the Imperial identity?
Absolutely. Well, it's a very important question, and of course, it's a question. I think it's a debate that in a way New Zealand hasn't had as fully as Australia has, because New Zealand's never put Gallipoli quite as high on the order of priorities in terms of an Anzac identity and where New Zealand would define itself. Australia, of course, is having this debate in spades at the moment, precisely because there are many Australians who would say, why do we have to identify ourselves in terms of our military capabilities and our military performance and a battle, rather than in terms of the foundation of the Commonwealth of Australia, which has already taken place over a decade before the outbreak of the First World War. And of course, that's a very fair question. Australia exists in an independent state with its own constitution, without Gallipoli. And of course, it's also, and this comes back to the point about the divisiveness of Hughes's policies, that given what I said about the difficulty of recruiting in the later stages of the war, it's not actually a unifying inheritance from Gallipoli. It's a divisive legacy from Gallipoli, because it makes the returned soldier the embodiment of Australianness rather than anybody else. And those who oppose conscription, who, for example, were in the Labour Party, would not see themselves as part of that story. And one of the benefits that New Zealand has, first of all, in not necessarily putting Gallipoli as high on the pedestal. I mean, Gallipoli clearly is on the pedestal of New Zealand and is important in New Zealand's sense of identity. I'm not disputing that for a moment. It clearly has a role in that establishment. But you think of how I'm reminded, because I was having to use, I was speaking in Auckland just over a month ago, and it was the event when the New Zealand, there was an event in Auckland, a service at Senator at the War Memorial Museum for the dispatch of the contingent, the advance contingent to Samoa. And I could not resist the temptation, but to quote Seddon in 1891, when New Zealand was not given Samoa, but Samoa was given to Germany. He said, Samoa is our Alsace. In other words, New Zealand has a pretty clear idea by 1891 what is New Zealand, where New Zealand's ambitions run, which are independent of anything that comes from London. So I think that you're absolutely right. There is a need not to go all the way with the Gallipoli story, and I think it has become. If you read the book by James Brown, what is it called? Where is Anzac or something, which came out 2 years ago, which argues exactly this point. And there were a group of 4 Australian historians 2 years before that who raised the same issue. Why should we have to understand Australian history through the prism of this particular action? Which, after all, apart from the odds, is also a defeat.
There was another question.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm just trying to relate the depth of public support for the war in New Zealand. I think you talked about 20,000 people there. Was there the same phenomenon that you had with Kitchener's appeal and the development of the Powell's regiments? Did that occur in New Zealand to the same extent or not?
There is, my source for this is Paul Baker's book on conscription in New Zealand, and he would say there are differences. I mean, New Zealand recruits by the 4 major cities act as the centres for recruiting. So Auckland, Wellington in the North Island, and Christchurch and Dunedin in the South Island. And there are differences in rates of recruitment and in occupational background on recruits. I mean, clearly those engaged in agriculture, in farming, are very concerned about the potential loss of manpower, and that acts as a constraint. So it is seen as recruiting becomes divisive in that sense. The initial response is very powerful, very strong, and recruiting levels are high, as in Britain. The response is, and as in Australia, the response is very supportive. But what I don't know is what inspires them. If you read the press, of course there is reference to patriotism. I mean, by that imperial patriotism as much as New Zealand patriotism. And the reason I was actually in New Zealand in August was to attend a conference in Wellington on New Zealand's participation. I asked exactly this question, because here in this country we would say, well, the press may reflect one thing, but there are many other reasons for joining up. For example, unemployment soars at the beginning of the war because those industries that are not engaged in productions related to war have to lay workers off. And so people may join for reasons of job security. That when people know that they're going to be better off being paid in the army and get regular feeding and roofs over their heads, they may. Now that changes by the end of the year because there's full employment. But the early initial social recruits, economic motivations may be there. When I raised that in New Zealand, I asked Glenn Harper this, and Glenn Harper came back and said, oh no, there's no evidence of that whatsoever. I still have a question mark in my mind. I mean, I can't believe that there are people who aren't looking, apart from anything else, if you're married, you've got children, you need to sort out your family concerns before you join up. You need to know that they're secure, that you're not taking, and New Zealand is very slow to provide family support, guarantee jobs on your return, all the things that actually we know are important in Britain. So I think it's a great deal. I think that's an open question. Over impression, and the story that you will hear today in New Zealand, and you heard in New Zealand then, is that there's very strong support for this recruiting flourishes. And the numbers are there to support that. But what is motivating? Let's read.
Okay, we've got time for precisely 2 questions. So please, so the gentleman.
Thank you very much. Lockwood Smith, New Zealand High Commissioner. So you provoked me to make a comment and seek a reaction to it in what you said in comparing Australia and New Zealand with respect to the sacredness of Anzac Day.
I could see your reaction.
And I make this comment as someone who's lived in Australia.
Yeah.
I lived in Australia for quite a while, and of course I'm a very, very staunch Kiwi. It's fascinating in New Zealand. Of course, our national day, as many people know, is Waitangi Day, and that is the day when the British Crown signed the Treaty of Waitangi with the Māori chieftains, or a number, not all the Māori chieftains, but a number of the Māori chieftains of New Zealand. And of course, in many ways, that is the day that establishes our nationhood, really, because it's seen as the founding document for New Zealand. But what's fascinating is, in terms of, I mean, to me, as an academic, there's a difference between maybe academic analysis and how the people feel things. Yeah. And it's fascinating that in New Zealand, Anzac Day is undoubtedly New Zealand's most sacred day. And the number of people who, and it's grown over the years. It's fascinating during my lifetime. Those turning out for Anzac Day, the young people turning out wearing their grandfather's medals and great-grandfather's medals, quite staggering how, and it's similar to Australia, and as someone who's lived in both countries, I think, that the Anzac legend, even though it was a defeat, is fundamental to our identity as nations of impact in this world. And as someone who stood on Chinook Bear, where Colonel Malone took the Wellingtons to the furthest anyone got to it, Gallipoli there, that's very sacred ground for New Zealand. Okay, we got thrown off, we got beaten there finally, but my goodness, it is a very special thing in our history, because I think it's not so much the founding of our nation, it's not so much the legal bits. I mean, we finally didn't lose control from Westminster here until 1950 was when we tried to abolish our upper house. We finally cut our linkages with Westminster here. But in terms of the emotion or the significance of New Zealand and Australia as countries of impact in this world, I think Gallipoli and Anzac Day is quite unique. I'm interested in your reaction.
Right. But let me respond in 2 weeks. I mean, I'm absolutely not denying the importance today. But what's interesting is how Anzac Day has changed over time for New Zealand and for Australia. You're absolutely right that, and here I should say quickly, Jenny McLeod's not here by any chance. No, I mean, I'm not going to attack her, I'm going to praise her. Jenny McLeod has a book which, imminent next year, which will talk about some of these things. So what I'm saying in part is dependent on what I've learned from reading that. But she makes the point that the differences between the two countries are really quite striking in the early days. In the 1920s, the returned soldiers in Australia saw Anzac Day as a day to party, as indeed there was exactly the same happening here in terms of how many returning soldiers saw Armistice Day. By contrast, returned soldiers in New Zealand absolutely saw it as a sacred day to be observed as essentially as a Sunday should have been, with no horse racing, no pubs open, that sort of thing. So there's a difference there. And of course, for both countries, there was what then happened thereafter. In other words, Gallipoli was very important in 1915. And then, of course, there's much of the rest of the war, and as you know perfectly well, I mean, more New Zealanders killed at Passchendaele than killed at Gallipoli. You know, for all Malone, and you know, I'm not for a moment, I mean, I too find the whole story of Malone and Chinook Bear and so on, it's a very moving story, and I'm not a New Zealander, but I absolutely identify, I see that. But I think that the other thing we have to remember, and dare I say it, not when you're old enough to remember, is where this went in, say, the 1970s and 1980s, and where it is now. I mean, the extraordinary recovery of Anzac Day from a point where it was really, you know, when I was in Wellington a month ago, I went to, what's that bookshop by Tapapa, RTB's, and I bought the report produced by the church about what they were going to do about Anzac Day, because graffiti were emerging on war memorials, on the cenotaphs. There was agitation because of Vietnam, as there was in Australia. Attendance was dropping. There was a real concern. And you're right, you look at it now, the whole thing's just become enormous by comparison. The pressure to be at Gallipoli on the 25th of April, the pressure, if you're not there, to be somewhere else which you can associate with, is enormous. But that is a phenomenon of the last 25 years. And that is, to me, one of the issues which, I mean, this gives me an excuse to say something broader about the centenary. We do need to remember what we're doing with this war and its commemorative events. These are our purposes rather than their purposes. You know, we're using the past for a very contemporary set of priorities. And it's not to say it doesn't have antecedents. It doesn't, not to say it doesn't rest on something that happened in the past. But we are, you know, how it was handled. And of course, one of the decisions, key decisions after 1945, as with 11th of November in Britain, was did you put on the losses in later wars fought by Australia and New Zealand onto Anzac Day? And the answer is essentially you do. I mean, and that then means it's carrying the whole of New Zealand history for the last 100 years, and not just 1915.
A final question.
Alan Taylor, I'm a member of the New Zealand World War I Commemoration Committee, and I'm particularly interested in deserters. I went to lectures some years ago at the Navy Club, and some historians there described the treatment of British Army deserters. Under today's standards, they weren't tried at all according to our legal systems or military systems, but they're tried and shot within 24 hours. And how were the New Zealand and Commonwealth deserters treated? Were they offered post-traumatic stress disorder treatment or something else?
No, I mean, I'm sure you know perfectly well that the whole issue of psychological consequences of combat is being addressed really for the first time in this war. And people, you know, that we're talking about something that was entirely in an evolutionary stage in relation to military medicine. But of course it does actually get into the framework of military medicine in 1914-18 in a way that it has never done before. So this is one of the ways in which the war is showing change. With regard to the legal proceedings, I mean, undoubtedly, courts martial in 1914-18, although the procedure is very clear and the procedures are followed, would not be conducted were not very often conducted in accordance with the same legal standards that we would have today. That, in other words, often inexperienced officers would find themselves having to conduct a court martial for the first time. What you also, of course, though, need to remember too is of the roughly 1,200 convictions for desertion in the face of the enemy, a quarter, roughly, just over 300, result in executions. The rest, the vast majority, were pardoned. And the level of pardoning essentially increased as the war went on, with the recognition that the situation was more complicated than a pre-war regular army had reckoned it would be. So it's not to say that this meets the standards of 2014, but there's a great deal else that goes on in the First World War that does not meet the standards of 2014.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to invite Sir Graham to say a few words of thanks.
I said at the beginning how pleased I was when Sir Hew accepted this invitation. I have a double delight because I found his exposition stimulating, enticing, questioning, and certainly as a New Zealander, I look at the events of that time with a father who had been in the First War in quite a different light. And for that I personally thank you. I think we have had a rather gentle but thoughtful tour de force. Can I ask you please to join with me in thanking Sir Hew for his contribution to all our thoughts about the First War?